When I was 15, my dad passed away. Losing him was like my whole world flipped upside down. It was tough, but my dad was always the type to have everything planned out. You know, the kind of guy who'd keep receipts from 10 years ago just in case. He had his will set up long before he passed, and when I found out what was in it, I was shocked. After my dad's funeral, my mom wasted no time moving on. I get that maybe she was lonely, but it felt way too fast. Before I could even process everything, she was already talking about some guy she met, Rob. Next thing I knew, Rob was moving into our house. It was all happening so fast, and I barely had time to wrap my head around it. One day it was just me and my mom, and the next, there was this stranger acting like he belonged there. Rob seemed okay at first, but things started feeling off when he began moving his stuff in. My dad's belongings, his favorite chair, his tools, even the mug he used every morning, started disappearing. My mom kept saying, "We need to make room for Rob's things." It felt like she was erasing my dad little by little, and it hurt. A couple of months after my dad passed, I got news about the inheritance. It was probably the only good thing that happened during that time. The lawyer explained that my dad had left everything to me. His properties, his money, everything. My mom didn't get a penny. Legally, they weren't married, so she didn't have a claim. Still, it caught me off guard. I was just a kid, and suddenly I owned properties. It was overwhelming. My mom wasn't happy. She pretended to be supportive, saying things like, "Your dad loved you," but I could see it in her eyes. She probably assumed she'd get something, but nope, it was all mine. And because of the way my dad set things up, she couldn't challenge it. At first, my mom tried to play nice, but soon she started pressuring me, subtly hinting that I should share some of the inheritance with her. She brought up how it would be nice to transfer one of the properties to her, saying it would make Rob feel more secure. In her mind, this was about their future, but to me it felt like she was choosing him over me. I told her I couldn't, even if I wanted to. My dad's will was set up so I couldn't touch any of it until I was 21. The look on her face when I said that, I'll never forget it. Things got worse when Rob's kids moved in. They were around my age. His daughter was 19 and his son was 18, but my mom treated them differently. She was all about making sure they felt comfortable, while I felt like I was being pushed aside. She'd go on trips with them and suggest I spend time at my grandparents' house instead. It became clear that she was building a new family with Rob, and I wasn't part of it. By the time I turned 17, things had escalated between me and Rob. He acted like he was the man of the house, trying to tell me what I could and couldn't do. I pushed back, reminding him that the house wasn't his. I even gave him a dumb nickname just to get under his skin, and it worked. My mom kept trying to play peacemaker, telling me to respect him and that he was part of our family now. But I wasn't having it. It wasn't his house, and he wasn't my dad. One day, after another argument with Rob, my mom told me I needed to leave. She said it would be best if I found somewhere else to stay for a while. I couldn't believe it. I asked her, "You're kicking me out of my own house?" She just sighed and said, "It's not just your house, it's our home now." The hurt and anger hit me all at once. She was choosing them over me, her own son. I packed up my things and went to stay with my grandparents. They've always been there for me, and they welcomed me with open arms. My grandpa even said, "You'll always have a place here, kiddo." It was exactly what I needed to hear after everything that happened with my mom. But my mom kept visiting, acting like everything was fine. She'd bring over some of my old stuff and say things like, "I'm just trying to keep the peace." She didn't get it. She was the one who pushed me out. And she kept talking about how Rob needed space to feel at home, but it was clear that it wasn't just about that. She had chosen her new life with him and his kids, and I was just an afterthought. Eventually, I realized that my mom was never going to be the parent I needed her to be. She was too focused on building her new life with Rob. So I started focusing on myself, on school, my friends, and my grandparents. They became my real family during that time, and I learned to stand on my own 2 feet. It wasn't easy, but it was probably the best thing I could have done. By the time I finished high school and moved into my grandparents' place, I had finally found some stability. It was weird, but living with them made me feel grounded in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. My grandparents were amazing, and they always made sure I knew I was welcome there. No strings attached. They never made me feel like a burden, and I felt safer with them than I ever did after my dad passed away. When I graduated, I knew I had to start thinking about my future, and that meant taking a closer look at the properties my dad left me. One of those properties was the house where my mom and Rob were living, the same house I had grown up in before everything went south. It was a solid house in a decent neighborhood, and I knew it could be rented out if I played my cards right. With my degree in hand and the idea of going back to school for a master's degree on the horizon, I figured why not renovate the place and rent it out for some extra income. I knew I'd have to talk to my mom about my plans, and I wasn't looking forward to that conversation. I didn't expect her to take it well, but there was no getting around it. The house was mine, and it was time I took control of my future. So I went over to the house one day, hoping to have a mature discussion about the renovations and give them some time to figure out their next steps. When I got to the house, nobody answered the door. The place was dead quiet, and their car wasn't in the driveway. I figured maybe they were out running errands, so I waited for a while, but it became clear they weren't coming back anytime soon. I tried calling my mom, left her a voicemail, and even sent her a text saying I wanted to talk. No response. Later that night, I found out from my grandma that they were on vacation. They'd gone down to Florida for a few days, enjoying a beach getaway while I was trying to figure out how to talk to them about reclaiming the house. It was frustrating. I felt like my mom was avoiding me on purpose, dodging the conversation because she knew what was coming. After a few more days of radio silence, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Legally, the house was mine. My name was on the deed, and I was the one paying the property taxes every year. So, I had every right to start the renovation process. It was drastic, but I decided to change the locks. I knew it would send a message that I was serious about my plans, and I couldn't have them treating it like a vacation home while I was trying to move forward with my life. I called a locksmith and got the locks changed. While I was at the house, I took a look around. It was strange being back in the place where I grew up, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Everything felt different, like I was walking through someone else's life. My mom and Rob had filled it with their own stuff, and seeing how they had made it their own only made me more determined to take it back. The next day, my phone blew up with missed calls and angry voicemails from my mom. She was furious, demanding to know why they couldn't get into the house. In her voicemails, she kept saying things like, "How could you do this to us?" and "This is so disrespectful." I knew she'd be upset, but hearing her like that hit me harder than I expected. When I finally answered her call, she started shouting before I could even get a word in. "Why did you lock us out of the house?" she screamed. I tried to stay calm and explained that I'd been trying to reach her for days, but she didn't want to hear it. She kept going on about how they had nowhere else to go, and that I was being unfair. I reminded her that I had every right to take back the house. It was mine. I also told her I was giving them 2 weeks to figure out their next steps, but after that, I needed to start the renovations. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she finally spoke. Her voice was low and cold when she said, "I never thought you'd do this to your own mother." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew I couldn't back down. This was about me taking control of my own life, and sometimes that means making tough decisions, even when it hurts. I didn't hear from her for the rest of the day, but the next morning I went back to the house to start preparing for the renovations. When I pulled up, my stomach sank. My mom and Rob were standing in the driveway, both looking furious. Rob stormed up to me, trying to intimidate me into letting them stay. "You think you can just kick us out like this? You've got no right," he barked. I stood my ground. "This isn't your house, and it never was. I'm the one paying for it, and I'm the one calling the shots," I said. He was fuming, but he couldn't argue with that. My mom, on the other hand, started crying, saying I was putting them on the street. She told me I was acting just like my father, though she didn't mean that in a good way. It was hard seeing her cry, but I had to remind myself that this was the right thing to do. I wasn't going to let them guilt-trip me into giving up what was mine. I told them again that they had 2 weeks to move out, and after that, the renovations would begin. As I walked away, I felt a mix of emotions, relief that I had stood my ground, but also a deep sadness that things had come to this dot. Over the next few days, the guilt started to creep in. My mom's relatives began calling me, telling me I was being cruel and selfish. They acted like I was the villain, as if I was kicking my mom out for fun. It was frustrating, but I tried to block it out. My grandma noticed how stressed I was and reminded me that my dad had left me the house for a reason. "Don't let them guilt trip you into thinking you're wrong," she said. It helped, but the phone calls and messages didn't stop. The worst part was when one of my mom's relatives sent me a long message telling me my mom was caught in the middle and that I needed to show compassion. That one really got under my skin. Caught in the middle? She was the one who chose them over me. Eventually, I stopped responding to the calls and texts. If they were so concerned about my mom, they could help her out. But none of them were offering her a place to stay or pitching in to help find her a new spot. It was easier for them to blame me. Typical. I focused on my renovation plans instead, meeting with the contractor and going over the designs. I knew that when the 2 weeks were up, I'd have to face my mom and Rob again. I hoped they'd find somewhere else by then, but deep down, I knew they weren't going to make this easy. Still, I was ready to follow through. When the day came, I pulled up to the house and saw my mom, Rob, and a few of their relatives standing around. My heart sank, but I knew I had to stay calm. My mom rushed over, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe you do this to us. You're my son. How could you turn your back on me when I need you the most?" I took a deep breath and told her, "Mom, I gave you 2 weeks. That's fair, and you know it. This is my house, and I have every right to take it back." She shook her head, saying I was being unreasonable. Then Rob jumped in, all fired up. "This is our home. You can't just take it from us like this." I stood my ground. "Actually, I can. Legally, it's my property. I've been more than patient, and now it's time for you to move out." The tension was thick, but I knew I had to stick to my decision. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about reclaiming my life and doing what was best for my future. As I stood there in front of my mom and Rob, surrounded by a few of their relatives, I felt the weight of the situation hit me again. This wasn't going to be easy. My mom kept crying, and Rob looked like he was ready to explode, but I knew I had to stay calm and stick to my decision. One of their relatives, an aunt I didn't even recognize, stepped forward and started lecturing me about family. "Family is supposed to stick together. Your mom has done so much for you, and now you're just abandoning her?" she said, her voice dripping with judgment. It was like they were all trying to gang up on me, making me feel like I was the bad guy in all of this. I wanted to snap back, to tell her that I wasn't the one who abandoned anyone, but I held my tongue. Instead, I kept my voice steady and told her, "This isn't your business. My dad left me this house for a reason, and I'm doing what I have to do." She scoffed, clearly not happy with my response, and turned away, muttering something about how I was heartless. At that moment, I realized this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. They weren't just going to leave quietly. They were hoping to wear me down, hoping that if they pushed hard enough, I'd give in. But I couldn't let that happen. My mom, still sobbing, begged me again. "I don't know where we'll go. We don't have any money saved up for this." Her voice was full of desperation, and I could see the tears streaming down her face. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I'm sorry, but I gave you 2 weeks. That's all I can offer." That's when she switched tactics, asking for more time. "Just 1 more month," she pleaded. "We'll definitely find something by then." Her voice was shaky, and for a second I felt myself wavering. She was my mom, after all, and hearing her like that made me feel guilty, even though I knew I shouldn't. But then I remembered how she'd used that same tone before, always asking for more time, more leeway, more understanding. It had been going on for years, and nothing had changed. If I gave her another month, I knew I'd be standing here again in 4 weeks having the same conversation. "I've already given you all the time I can," I said firmly. "I can't wait any longer." Rob, of course, jumped in again, ranting about how I was kicking them out with nowhere to go. But I didn't let him get to me. I just kept repeating myself. "This is my house, and I'm taking it back." I felt like a broken record, but I knew I had to keep saying it. They were hoping to wear me down, but I couldn't let that happen. Then, out of nowhere, Rob's stepdaughter came out onto the porch, holding her stomach and looking like she was about to cry. She was only 19, and I hadn't even noticed her standing there until she stepped forward. She looked scared, vulnerable, and that's when my mom dropped the bombshell. "She's pregnant," my mom blurted out. "You can't do this to her. You can't kick us out when she's about to have a baby." For a moment, I was stunned. I hadn't expected that. Seeing Rob's stepdaughter standing there, clearly struggling with the situation, hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt awful for her. Being pregnant is a huge responsibility, and the last thing anyone wants is to be homeless when they're expecting a child. But even though I felt bad for her, I knew I couldn't let that change things. It wasn't my responsibility to solve their problems. I had given them time, 2 whole weeks, to figure something out, and I wasn't going to let guilt sway me now. I took a deep breath and told them, "I'm really sorry she's going through this, but this is still my house. You have 2 weeks. I'm not asking you to leave today, but you need to find another place." My mom started sobbing even harder, and Rob stood there looking like he was about to explode. The tension was unbearable, and I just couldn't stand being there anymore. I'd said what I needed to say, and I wasn't going to stand around and keep arguing with them. So I turned and walked away, heading back to my car. As I walked off, I could hear my mom yelling after me, calling me heartless and selfish, saying she couldn't believe her own son would do this to her. Her words stung, but I kept walking. I had to. If I stopped, if I turned around and saw her crying again, I knew I'd start doubting myself, and I couldn't afford to do that. When I finally got back to my car, I just sat there for a while, staring out the windshield and trying to breathe. The mix of emotions was overwhelming. Relief that I had finally taken control, but also guilt and sadness that it had come to this. No one wants to be the bad guy, especially not with their own family. But I knew I had to be firm. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about my future, my life, and the opportunities my dad had left for me. As the days went by, I focused on my renovation plans, meeting with the contractor and going over the details. I tried to push the guilt aside and remind myself that I was doing what needed to be done. But that didn't stop the calls from my relatives, all of them telling me I was wrong, that I was being cruel to my mom, that I needed to give her more time or let her stay. None of them seemed to understand that I had already been more than fair. I wasn't kicking her out for fun. I was reclaiming what was mine, what my dad had left me for my future. And I wasn't going to let them take that away from me, no matter how much they tried to make me feel guilty. My grandma noticed how stressed I was getting, and she sat me down one afternoon. "You did what you had to do," she told me. "Don't let them make you feel bad for doing the right thing. Your dad left you that house for a reason. You're honoring his memory by making sure it stays yours." That helped, more than I realized at the time. Having her support, knowing that she understood, made the weight on my shoulders feel a little lighter. But the phone calls and messages kept coming, and each one felt like another punch to the gut. One day, I got a long text from one of my mom's relatives telling me how my mom was caught in the middle and that I needed to show compassion. That message made me so angry. Caught in the middle? She wasn't caught in the middle. She was the one who chose them over me, but I didn't respond. Getting into a back and forth with them wasn't going to help anything. It would just drag me down further. Instead, I focused on the renovations. I knew that once I got things started, I'd have to face my mom and Rob again. And as much as I hated the idea of another confrontation, I was ready. I had come too far to back down now. By the time the 2 weeks were up, I knew I'd done everything I could to be fair. I'd given them the time they needed, and I'd been more patient than I thought possible. But when I pulled up to the house that day, I could see right away that they hadn't made any progress. There they were again, my mom, Rob, and a few of their friends and relatives, all standing in the driveway like they were preparing for another battle. My stomach dropped, but I reminded myself that I had done everything right. I'd given them more than enough time, and now it was up to them to figure out their next steps. My mom rushed over to me, tears in her eyes, and launched into another emotional plea. "I can't believe you'd really do this to us. You're my son. How could you turn your back on me when I need you the most?" But I had prepared myself for this. I stayed calm, kept my voice steady, and told her, "Mom, I gave you 2 weeks, that's fair, and you know it. This is my house, and I have every right to take it back." That's when Rob jumped in, full of anger and trying to intimidate me again. "This is our home. You can't just take it from us like this." But I didn't flinch. "Actually, I can," I said firmly. "Legally, it's my property. I've been more than patient, and now it's time for you to move out." The tension was thick, and I could feel the weight of all their eyes on me. But I knew I had to stand my ground, no matter how hard it felt. As I stood there, facing my mom, Rob, and their little group of supporters, I knew this was the final test. It was clear they were hoping I'd break, that I'd feel guilty enough to back down, but I couldn't. I'd come too far, and I wasn't about to let all their emotions sway me now. This was my house, my future, and I had to see it through. My mom, still crying, tried one last time. "Please, we have nowhere else to go. You can't do this to us. I'm your mother. I raised you. I did everything for you, and now you're just throwing us out?" Her words stung, but I knew better than to fall for it. This wasn't about me betraying her or abandoning her. This was about me taking control of my life and reclaiming what my dad left me. My mom had made her choices, and now I was making mine. "I'm not throwing you out," I said calmly. "I gave you 2 weeks. I've been fair. I've done everything I can to give you time, but this is my house. I have to start the renovations." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "You're being heartless. I never thought my own son would do this to me." Those words hit me hard, but I couldn't let them break me. I'd already gone over this in my mind 1,000 times. I'd given them time, more than enough time, and now it was up to them to figure out what to do next. Rob, still fuming, tried to step in again, puffing up like he was going to intimidate me into backing down. "You don't understand, kid. We've built a life here. You think you can just take it away from us? You have no idea what you're doing." I stared him down, refusing to let him get under my skin. "Actually, I do. This house belongs to me. I'm doing what's best for my future, and you don't get to tell me otherwise." He clenched his fists, and for a second I thought he was going to take a swing at me. But my mom stepped in, holding him back and telling him to calm down. The tension between us was thick, but I wasn't about to back down now. This was my moment to take back control. The relatives who had gathered around started chiming in again. One of them, a cousin I think, tried to guilt-trip me, saying, "Your mom's done so much for you. This is how you repay her? Kicking her out on the street?" I couldn't hold back anymore. "She's not on the street," I snapped, my voice firm but not angry. "I gave her time. I've done everything I could to be fair, but this house belongs to me, and I need to move forward. If you're so concerned, maybe you should offer her a place to stay." The cousin scowled and muttered something under her breath, clearly not expecting me to throw it back at her like that. I could tell the crowd was starting to realize they weren't going to break me, and I could feel the power shift ever so slightly in my favor. My mom, still sobbing, made one last plea. "Just one more week. Please, just one more week, and I promise we'll figure something out." I closed my eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then looked at her. "I can't," I said softly but firmly. "I've already given you 2 weeks. This is my house, and I need to start the renovations. You have until the end of today to get your things." It was like I could see the reality finally sinking in for her. Her face crumpled, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Rob looked like he wanted to argue some more, but he knew it was over too. They didn't have a leg to stand on, and they both knew it. I could hear my mom muttering under her breath as she walked away, telling me how cold I was, how I was just like my father, always thinking about myself. It hurt, but I wasn't going to let her words tear me down. I'd heard it all before, and I knew it wasn't about me being selfish. This was about taking back what was mine. As they slowly filed back into the house to start packing, I stayed outside, giving them the space they needed. I didn't want to make things worse by hovering, but I knew I couldn't leave until they were out. So I stood in the driveway, waiting and watching as they carried boxes and bags out to the car, one by one. It took hours, way longer than I expected, but eventually they had all their things packed up. My mom came out last, wiping tears from her face, and stood in front of me for a moment. I could see the hurt in her eyes, and a part of me wanted to apologize, to make everything better, but I knew that wasn't possible. "I hope you're happy," she said bitterly, her voice raw with emotion. "You've gotten what you wanted. I just hope you can live with yourself after this." I didn't say anything. I just watched as she walked to the car, climbed inside, and drove off with Rob and the rest of them. The house, my house, was finally mine again, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt heavy, like I'd lost something in the process, even though I knew I'd done the right thing. After they left, I walked back into the house, the silence almost deafening. I stood in the living room looking around at the empty space where all their things used to be. It felt strange, almost surreal, to have the house back to myself after everything that had happened. The next day, I met with the contractor and started the renovation process. It felt good to finally move forward, to take control of my life again. As the work began, I focused on my plans for the future, going back to school, getting my master's degree, building a career. My dad had left me this house so I could have a better future, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. But even though I knew I'd made the right decision, it didn't make the situation with my mom any easier. She didn't talk to me for weeks after that. When she finally did reach out, it was mostly to complain about how hard things were for her and how I'd made everything worse. I tried to keep my distance, knowing that engaging with her would only drag me back into the guilt and drama that I'd been trying to escape. Over time, I learned to accept that my relationship with my mom was never going to be what I wanted it to be. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. It hurt, but I realized that I couldn't live my life trying to fix her mistakes or make her happy at the expense of my own well-being. The renovations went well, and I eventually rented out the house, turning it into a steady source of income. It felt good to finally have control over my future, to build something for myself without anyone else's interference. As for my mom and Rob, they found a place to stay with one of her relatives, and as far as I know, they're still together. I see my mom occasionally, but our relationship will never be the same. There's too much history, too much resentment for things to go back to the way they were. And that's okay. I've come to terms with it. At the end of the day, I know I made the right choice. My dad left me the house because he wanted me to have a future, and I honored his memory by taking control of it. It wasn't easy, but it taught me one of the most important lessons I could ever learn. Sometimes, you have to stand up for yourself, even when it means making tough decisions that others won't understand. And sometimes, taking care of yourself means walking away, even from the people who are supposed to care the most. That's the end of the story. Thanks for reading through it all. Let me know if you need any changes or want to discuss anything else.